Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
And welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s program with author Michael Scheuer. I am Heidi Shoup, President of the Council, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening as we gather to expand our knowledge and understanding of Osama bin Laden, and hopefully also our understanding of how the United States has responded to and continues to respond to his actions and his goals. With us is Michael Scheuer, author of the new book, Osama bin Laden. Currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Center for Peace and Security Studies, he was for 22 years an intelligence officer with the CIA. There he served as chief of the Bin Laden Issue Station, the tracking unit in the Counterterrorism Center, from 1996 to 1999. After 9/11, he worked as special advisor to his successor in that office from September 2001 until November of 2004. In 2004, Scheuer became a public figure when it leaked that he was the anonymous author of the 2004 book, Imperial Hubris: Why the West is Losing the War on Terror, in which he criticized many of the United States' assumptions about Islamist insurgencies and Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden actually acknowledged the book and its assessment in a 2007 statement mentioning Michael's name and suggesting that his analysis was correct. In an earlier, also at the time anonymous book, Through Our Enemy's Eyes, written in 1999, he argued that the West's road to hell lies in approaching the bin Laden problem with the presumption that only the lunatic fringe could oppose what the United States is trying to accomplish through its foreign policy toward the Muslim world. Bin Laden's philosophy is slowly harnessing the two most powerful motivating forces in contemporary international affairs: religion and nationalism. Since leaving the CIA in 2004, Mr. Scheuer has worked as a news analyst at CBS, regularly appears on international media outlets, and participates in conferences on terrorism and national security issues. In 2008, he wrote Marching Toward Hell: America and Islam After Iraq. After his remarks, Dr. Scheuer will take questions, and I ask you to please come up to the microphone to ask your questions so that you'll be heard by the audience at home, as well as the audience here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Scheuer.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I always get a little nervous with a backdrop. I teach at Georgetown, and they have installed new computer systems in the classrooms, so you can have things come down from the ceiling and go up, and you can project on them. Two falls ago now, the fall of '09, on my first class on a Monday night, we went in, and no one knew how to operate the material, and the backdrop on the screen was for a class that preceded us in cinema, and it was a course in the analysis of the erotic films of Weimar Germany. And the backdrop was rather disconcerting, but we found someone to turn off the computer. So this one doesn't look as enticing, I guess. Let me say, it always seems necessary to say that I come to bury bin Laden and not to praise him. But I do think we have not taken the measure of the man, and too often we equate silence with victory. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about our failure to even understand our failure to understand what motivates the enemy. To begin tonight, I would ask that you imagine that you are an eminent lawyer preparing to argue a case before the Supreme Court. And also to imagine that because you are a confident, experienced, distinguished, and usually successful lawyer, you decide to enter the court and present your argument without having troubled yourself to look up, read, and then study all of the written materials pertinent to the case. Indeed, so confident are you of victory that you did not even read the materials prepared for your use by your team of legal clerks. Now, this scenario is, of course, hard to imagine. A good lawyer, after all, presumably would not enter a courtroom to argue a case without thorough preparation. Likewise, it should be just as hard to imagine that any American president or political leader would make the most important decision of his or any presidency, that is the decision to go to war, without reviewing and absorbing all materials, written, graphic, or oral, in order to identify his enemy's motivation and goals. One would imagine that a president, not less than a lawyer, needs to know his opponent as well as possible. And yet, I would argue that US leaders have been waging a war against Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and their allies without bothering to study his words in an effort to absorb what the US military calls the commander's intent. As a result, come 27 August 2011, Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and their allies will have been waging war on the United States for 15 years. And they will still be a basically unknown quantity to US policymakers, generals, senior intelligence officers, and even so-called al-Qaeda experts in the public sector. That this is the case is purely the result of sloth or negligence, because since he formally declared war on 23 August 1996, bin Laden has, at least in one way, followed the model of America's victorious North Vietnamese enemies, Ho Chi Minh and General Giap. Like our North Vietnamese vanquishers, bin Laden has made sure that the US government and people have no credible excuse for failing to understand what motivates the war being waged against us by al-Qaeda and other Islamists. Through numerous statements, speeches, and interviews, bin Laden has explicitly explained the Islamist grievances, their religious motivation, their war aims, a metric for measuring progress, and their terms for ending the war. Bin Laden's words, moreover, have been plentiful and are increasingly accessible in English. My own archive, for example, contains over 175 primary source documents, numbering well over 800 pages of material. This is a significant amount of primary source material, and yet, the only reasonable claim I can make about my archive is that it holds only the primary documents I know of and can find, and certainly not all that exist. Given this body of primary source documents, it is odd that so few of them have been exploited by the Western political leaders, writers, and analysts who have spoken on the issue or produced books meant to explain who bin Laden is and what he is up to. To date, works on bin Laden, with a few notable exceptions, especially Peter Bergen's splendid and really indispensable work, The Osama bin Laden I Know, have been based in the main on what others have said about bin Laden and not what he has said about himself. These others generally come in two batches. The first tends to be such enemies of bin Laden and al-Qaeda as former Saudi intelligence chief Prince Turki al-Faisal, the long and still imprisoned but now supposedly reformed Egyptian scholar Dr. Fadl, and the former Islamist firebrand and mentor of bin Laden, Sheikh Salman al-Auda, who now runs a television program and internet site for the Saudi government. The second batch of individuals is found among former or current mujahideen who have fallen out with bin Laden. Among them are such men as you may be familiar with: Abu Musab al-Suri, Abdullah Anas, Abu Walid al-Masri, and Abu Jandal. It is worth noting that the men in this latter group broke with bin Laden over strategy, tactics, timing, targeting, or a concern for the Taliban regime's survival, but they did not become his enemies. they still view him as an important, accomplished, and inspirational Islamist leader. They and most other Islamists differ with bin Laden over tactics and targets, but their ultimate goals for the jihad are very comparable to Osama bin Laden's. While what bin Laden's enemies and former close associates have said about him are a major resource when analyzing his thought, talents, weaknesses, intellect, successes, and failures, it is not a sufficient base of data on which to develop a well-rounded assessment of the man. It is quite simply half the story or less. To accomplish the task of accurate understanding, what others say must be assessed alongside the primary source bin Laden documents. And yet Western politicians, generals, policymakers, journalists, and writers have largely failed to do so. More often than not, they refer to these primary documents as simply rantings, ravings, or unbridled diatribes, as if they really emanated from the imaginary madman so often described by US presidents, British and other European prime ministers, and Arab tyrants. It must be said that leading Muslim writers and journalists, men like Rahimullah Yousafzai and Abdulbari Atwan, have paid much closer attention to bin Laden's words, and especially to his use of Islamic history. And by and large, they have produced more sophisticated and accurate portraits of him than those that have appeared in the West. Since 9/11, a score or more books have been written by Western and Muslim authors about bin Laden and al-Qaeda. In regard to bin Laden, these books have focused on his character, intelligence, leadership talent, public speaking ability, skill at exploiting Islam and its history and his rhetoric, his international influence, organizational skills, and modern management style. I believe the best of these books are by Peter Bergen, Abdulbari Atwan, and Steve Cole. Among the rest, there are a dozen or so books by Western and non-Muslim authors that have come to be categorized as essential works on bin Laden and al-Qaeda. In my new book, I have examined each of these and noted the number of citations of bin Laden's works, speeches, interviews, statements, essays, and so on, that are contained in the author's endnotes. Let me say that I have also noted where a large number of citations in these books pertain to relatively few primary documents. I did not, of course, have access to electronic manuscript versions of these books. My count is derived from a rather anachronistic line-by-line reading of each book's endnotes, keeping score as I went. I do not claim these counts are exact, but they are quite close to the mark and give a clear idea of the degree to which each author exploited primary sources. I will not take the time to go through the entire list, but will cite three of what are widely considered to be the best books about Osama bin Laden to note how many of the 175 plus primary sources the authors used. The first is a book by the rather renowned British journalist Jason Burke called Al-Qaeda, Casting a Shadow of Terror. He cited 5 documents. Steve Cole, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA and Afghanistan and bin Laden, 2 citations. Finally, another Pulitzer Prize winner, Lawrence Wright, The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11, 28 citations, 22 of which refer to 3 documents. The list shows, I believe, that despite the large body of primary source documents at hand, few of them have been exploited by Western writers and analysts who have produced books meant to explain bin Laden. The reason for this failure is not entirely clear to me, but it seems to pivot off the reluctance of some authors and most politicians to accept that in the early 21st century, the Islamic religion can possibly be the driving force behind bin Laden, al-Qaeda, their allies, and massive numbers of other Muslims. They seem even more reluctant to face, or at least publicly state, the fact that in the eyes of most Muslims, Western policies and actions in the Islamic world are not benign and humanitarian, but rather anti-Muslim and lethal. The bulk of bin Laden scholarship, moreover, is extraordinarily presentist. When Western authors encounter thinking or mores they consider anachronistic in this modern world, they default to asserting that ideas that run counter to the tenets of secularism, multiculturalism, globalization, and diversity can only be held by limited numbers of medieval, violence-prone, pseudo-Islamic thugs. The predominantly secular authors, for example, hate the absence of women's rights in much of the Muslim world, and so Islamists are always arch-misogynists. The writers likewise hate the motivational power of Islam across the Muslim world, a power that indeed advises violence can at times be needed to defend the faith. And so their Islamists are described as distorters of their religion. And most of all, these writers fear any threat to what they believe is progress. And so, notwithstanding the heart-worn on-the-sleeve prose used by many of them, they prefer to combat the Islamists with a status quo, featuring the West's defense of Arab tyrannies, efforts to impose secular democracy on Muslims to negate Islam's overwhelmingly martial doctrine of jihad, and claims that spreading Islamic violence is due to such bizarre and clearly wrong factors as nihilism, the lack of gender mixing, illiteracy, and the so-called hijacking of the Quran. A close reading of bin Laden's words would unquestionably offend the presentists' optimistic view of a secular world triumphing over superstitious religion. And so they have ignored the appeal of these words to tens and even hundreds of millions of Muslims, much to the detriment of Western security, economic vitality, prospects for peace, and the understanding of their fellow citizens. Because many of the essential bin Laden books lack a thorough assessment of the primary sources, it is worth looking at a few of the pieces of what has become common wisdom in America in regard to al-Qaeda and bin Laden, a common wisdom that is based primarily on these books and the words of politicians. In my own work, I have found that these conclusions often wither to inaccuracy after a comprehensive assessment of primary sources. One of the most common pieces of common wisdom, if you will, is the central importance of radical modern Islamic theorists on the thought of Osama bin Laden. Most often cited is the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb from the 1950s and 60s. This theorist of jihad portrayed jihad as a Hobbesian war of all against all. Qutb is seen in the West as the principal shaper of bin Laden's thought and actions. But in the corpus of bin Laden's work, there is not a single quotation from Qutb, nor does bin Laden ever even mention his name. That bin Laden accepts some of what Qutb said is clear. As long as Qutb does not stray from the Salafist view of the Quran and the Sunnah, the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, bin Laden concurs with him. But this is really no more than saying that the Quran and the Sunnah are central to bin Laden and most Muslims. When Qutb diverges from these sources, bin Laden clearly has no use for his recommendations and does not deign to even refer to him. The idea that a direct line can be drawn from Qutb's rather odd and extraordinarily violent interpretation of Islam and bin Laden's traditional jihadi Salafism simply cannot be substantiated. By studying and analyzing Qutb and most other 20th century theorists of jihad, we learn much about the radicalizing milieu in which bin Laden's generation was reared, but almost nothing about the mature bin Laden's thought and motivation. A second piece of common wisdom is that Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's deputy, is really the eminence grise behind bin Laden. Western politicians and writers often refer to al-Zawahiri, the former Egyptian Islamic Jihad chief, as bin Laden's brain. An examination of bin Laden's work, however, reveals no significant impact by the Egyptian on his thought or his rhetoric. Indeed, such an assessment clearly delineates how far bin Laden has drawn al-Zawahiri away from his original positions and strategy. As with Qutb, bin Laden does not quote al-Zawahiri in his own statements, but he does stand with him as long as the Egyptian sticks to the above-mentioned foundational documents of Salafism. It is worth noting that bin Laden appears to have little use for any self-taught Islamist scholar, like the English major Qutb, the surgeon al-Zawahiri, or the Egyptian Islamic Jihad's electrical engineer turned Islamist theorist Muhammad al-Faraj. Bin Laden's respect is reserved for those scholars who have received a traditional and formal Salafist education via universities or private study with Islamist scholars, men such as Abdullah Azzam and Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. Ironically, bin Laden does not even usually refer to these scholars, even though he respects them. There is really no need to quote them directly. By simply quoting the Quran and the Sunnah, he is in essence quoting those scholars by putting credit where it belongs, in the hands of Allah and the Prophet Muhammad. Something we've heard in recent years, and especially from General Petraeus and his counterterrorism advisor, David Kilcullen, the Australian soldier, is that al-Qaeda is outside the parameters of the acceptable parameters of Islam, and they are indeed what are called takfiris. In other words, Muslims who take it upon themselves to decide if another Muslim is a good Muslim or not, and if the answer is negative, they are free to kill him and take his property. In a review of bin Laden's work, there's nothing but a thorough and unequivocal denunciation of takfiri doctrine. He repeatedly and effectively attacks those, especially the Saudi regime spokesman, who identify him or other al-Qaeda figures as takfiris. That said, bin Laden clearly recognizes and respects the massively negative impact on al-Qaeda if the Saudis or others succeeded in making the takfiri label stick. Bin Laden and his lieutenants seldom deign to respond to criticism or accusations from Western states or Arab tyrannies. But when accused of takfirism, he, Zawahiri, and other senior al-Qaeda leaders have been quick to rebut the accusations. Bin Laden clearly and very accurately foresees oblivion for al-Qaeda and its allies if the Muslim masses come to believe that they are takfiris. His concern is evident in that he twice used public statements to implicitly apologize to Muslims for the takfiri actions of al-Qaeda's commander in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and to assure them that they would not occur again. I assure Muslims in particular, I assure Muslims in general, and our people in the neighboring states to Iraq in particular, bin Laden said in apology for al-Zawahiri's actions in late 2007, that they will henceforth see nothing from the Mujahideen in Iraq but all that is good, God willing. We are your sons. The Muslim victims who fall in operations against the infidel crusaders or their usurper Iraqi agents are not intended targets. God knows that we are deeply saddened when some Muslims fall victim. Yet we hold ourselves responsible and seek God's forgivenesses for that. We beseech God to have mercy on the fallen and let paradise be their final abode. A fourth argument that's become common wisdom is that al-Qaeda has no central command and control. Again, let me return to Iraq. Al-Qaeda's commander there, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, behaved in a murderously takfiri manner and was really the only potentially fatal strategic threat al-Qaeda has faced since 9/11. Indeed, if the United States military did not kill him, al-Qaeda would have found a way to dispose of him, either by promoting him to a position where he would not command fighters or by killing him. Indeed, the relative ease with which U.S. interrogators claim to have elicited al-Zarqawi's location from a captured close associate is astounding and raises the possibility that al-Qaeda directed the man to allow himself to be captured and then provide the targeting data. Aside from the substantial but temporary damage al-Zarqawi did to al-Qaeda's position in Iraq and to the group's Muslim world standing, bin Laden's handling of what can be called the al-Zarqawi problem demonstrated his indirect managerial style. Avoiding public disputes with lieutenants and allies is always his priority. It also demonstrated the continuing hierarchical nature of al-Qaeda. Bin Laden did not take on al-Zarqawi in public, but assigned al-Zawahiri and another senior figure, known only by the name Atiyah, to bring al-Zarqawi back on al-Qaeda's non-Takfiri reservation. Al-Zawahiri did so in a measured but clearly pointed manner. He stressed al-Qaeda's respect for al-Zarqawi's success in killing Americans and their allies, but told him that he was part of a bigger whole that had an international agenda which was being damaged by his Takfiri actions, especially televised beheadings and the bombings of mosques and shrines. When al-Zarqawi took minimal remedial action, Atiyah followed with a much harsher letter. It opens by saluting al-Zarqawi's lethal successes against the United States, but then harshly chastises him for ignoring the fact that he is subordinate to bin Laden and al-Qaeda, demanding that his actions must complement, not retard, al-Qaeda's international goals, and pledging that he would be removed from commanding al-Qaeda in Iraq if he did not quickly fall into line behind the directions of al-Qaeda's central leadership. The content of both letters, as well as al-Qaeda's ongoing rebound in Iraq, ought to give pause to the authors who have identified al-Qaeda as either a non-centralized organization now isolated from independent affiliates, or as a doctrinally Takfiri organization. These authors are largely mistaken and have skewed the now losing U.S. military's understanding of its Islamist foes, as well as the doctrine it has shaped to defeat them. Fifth, al-Qaeda has failed. We hear that ever more frequently, most recently in Peter Bergen's new book. After reviewing bin Laden's words, it is irrefutably clear, I think, that he has always intended al-Qaeda's primary role to be that of inciting and instigating Muslims to jihad, not as a military machine meant to defeat Islam's enemy by itself or in alliance with a few other groups. Thus, the whole concept hawked by self-serving Western politicians that they have made Western populations safer because there has not been another 9/11 attack reflects only wishful thinking. Reflects not only wishful thinking, but a singular ignorance of al-Qaeda's goals and the expanding power of its media operations. At 9/11, for example, al-Qaeda's main planning, training, and operational platform was in Afghanistan. As 2011 enters its second month, the group retains part of that platform and has added viable and growing bases in Yemen, Pakistan, Iraq, Somalia, and North Africa. In addition, al-Qaeda's example of hurting the United States and then not only surviving, but growing in numbers and expanding geographically, has been an inspiration for continuing or increased organizational activity or violence by Islamist fighters in the North Caucasus, southern Thailand, Europe, across the Far East, Kashmir, the Arabian Peninsula, India, Nigeria, other places in West and East Africa, and in the United States and Canada. In short, al-Qaeda not only retains substantial military capabilities for a group of its limited size, but it has, since 9/11, developed an outsized media and geographical reach. In terms of inspiration and instigation capabilities, al-Qaeda is today exactly what bin Laden intended it to be, an unqualified success in inspiring Muslims to wage jihad across the Islamic world, both against the United States and their own oppressive governments. Today, al-Qaeda probably is about where bin Laden expected it to be, given his clear expectation of a multi-generational struggle and his frequent frustrated and chiding remarks to the many Muslim males who have yet to join the fight. A final piece of common wisdom that probably is very damaging and in that it is very misleading for Americans and Westerners generally is that the polling shows al-Qaeda is irrelevant. Not surprisingly, many non-Muslim authors place high value on the results of polling by reputable Western pollsters in the Muslim world, and some of it indeed is very valuable. But the polls tend to be celebrity measuring or personality-based in asking questions, such as, do you approve of Osama bin Laden, or would you want to live under a bin Laden government? And I believe these questions are virtually worthless. They disguise reality and give hope where there should be little. Today's low positive responses to such questions, for example, would skyrocket tomorrow if al-Qaeda attacks successfully in the United States, and especially in Israel. The key polling questions for us are the ones that mesh with what bin Laden identifies as the motivation for jihad and with what he wants to achieve. Questions such as, what do you think of U.S. foreign policy? Do you want to be governed with a large measure of Sharia law? Do you believe your current government is un-Islamic, has failed, and or is oppressive? Elicit the most informing responses. Polling shows virtual unanimous hatred among Muslims for U.S. foreign policy and current Muslim governments, and a large majority favoring a substantial measure of Sharia law in their governance. These results, moreover, are nearly the same among key cohorts, young and old, male and female, militant and moderate. As long as these results remain consistently high for protracted periods in these cohorts, as they have for a decade, bin Laden is on the right track for his purposes. Indeed, his refusal to use public words to build his own celebrity and his use of them to focus unrelentingly on al-Qaeda's 3 war aims, driving the United States from the Muslim world, destroying Israel and Arab tyrannies, and returning to the true Islam, amount to nothing short of genius in keeping Muslims focused on the issue of jihad and those threats that pose the most danger to them. As noted above, and when I started to speak also, none of this means that Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and their Islamist allies are 10-foot-tall enemies. Indeed, with any kind of manly Western response, both could have been eliminated at almost any time between bin Laden's 1996 declaration of war and mid-1999. That, of course, did not happen, mostly because of the inferior and timid quality of Western political and military leadership. What a reading of the primary bin Laden documents does suggest, however, is that 15 years into the war bin Laden is waging, the West's understanding of its Islamist enemy's leader and his goals is at best marginal. And I would contend this is because the West's political leaders have failed to read what he has said, accept that his motivation is what he says it is, and recognize that he intends to do exactly what he said he will do. This reality is even more troubling, as there is no doubt that the U.S., British, and other Western intelligence services have provided their elected and civil servant superiors with detailed analyses of bin Laden's words ever since he declared war, and that these analyses surely contradict the popular "they hate us for our freedom" mantra that is often stated by our political leaders. Thinking back nearly 90 years, the West last made this kind of deliberate error when it failed to read, but readily scorned and ridiculed, the public words of a jailed former corporal in the Kaiser's army. Now as then, it would be wise to follow the timeless guidance of another man who intended, and indeed came closest to destroying the United States. The better rule, Robert E. Lee once wrote, is to judge our adversaries from their standpoint and not from our own. It is always proper to assume that the enemy will try to do what he said he will try to do. Thank you all very much. Questions, if you have any?
As far as we can tell, does Bin Laden and al-Qaeda have any role or involvement in the recent uprising in the Middle East, Egypt, Tunisia?
I know of none, sir, except I saw that al-Qaeda's affiliate or branch, call it what you will, in North Africa, encouraged the process and is promising to take part in it as it unfolds since Ben Ali left in Tunisia. There was also a long statement today by Ayman al-Zawahiri urging the Egyptians to keep it up, to overthrow Mubarak and keep going. I would doubt, sir, that they had any immediate on-the-ground activity in promoting what's going on, but certainly they're going to take advantage of it. And anything that weakens the dictators who govern the Middle East benefits them, and the destruction of those tyrannies certainly undermines Israeli security. So whether or not they're involved in it, it benefits them very much.
My question is rather simple. I haven't read your book yet. Going to buy it and read it. Two
My
parts.
grandchildren, thank you, sir.
Oh, okay. Is he still alive? And if he should die tomorrow, next week, next month, are they ever going to tell us?
I was mentioning to Heidi beforehand, I did a talk Monday night at Politics and Prose, and we had 4 9/11 truthers who are absolutely convinced that bin Laden is dead, has been dead, and somehow we're recording his voice. And I mentioned the fact that NSA does indeed do a voice print every time, and they prove to be his. But I was informed that that the truthers know better, that voice prints aren't good. Let me say a couple of things. I think it would be extraordinarily difficult to keep his voice or keep his death a secret. I think, first of all, I would say that. Second, we have now a 15-year track record of al-Qaeda never hiding the death of a leader. They very often not only announce the death of a leader, they announce his successor. And in recent years, they've rubbed our nose in it by publishing a curriculum vitae for the successor on the internet. The third thing I would say, I guess the fourth, if you include the proof of the voice prints, is that in his culture, of course, they would be celebrating as well as grieving his death, because he would have achieved his goal of dying in battle for what he saw was a battle for God, anyway. So we can operate on best case assumptions that he's dead. I think there's many senior government officials who hope he is, but I don't think he is. You know, for a pedantic fellow like me, there is a consistency in the way his words are structured and spoken and framed over the course of 15 years that if they weren't his, I think myself and other people would recognize it. Will they tell us if he's dead? I think the enemy will tell us, sir. I don't think they're going to keep it a secret. His job is largely done, but he needs to be killed simply because if al-Qaeda has another large attack in the United States on the books, he's at the heart of it.
If Osama bin Laden were to die tomorrow, assuming that he is alive,
yes.
How would that change the sort of decentralized structure of al-Qaeda and our approach to dealing with it?
I tend to think it would have some impact on al-Qaeda simply because al-Qaeda is an absolutely unique organization in the Muslim world. We have all watched the Palestinians for 40 years. They can't go from one side of the street to the other side of the street in less than 6 months, and they're all the same ethnic group. They speak the same language. Al-Qaeda, there are Japanese Muslims and Pakistani Muslims and Saudis and Yemenis and North Americans and Europeans. Bin Laden has been an extraordinarily successful chief executive officer, if you will, in a modern sense, in keeping all of those forces together. Without his presence, things would not fall apart, but they would become very acrimonious. Zawahiri would take over in the short term, but he's too avuncular, too sharp-edged to be the leader. And there's too much animosity among Saudis and Egyptians. The Saudis want to be the fighters that the Egyptians are, and the Egyptians want their hands on the money like the Saudis have it. So there'll be trouble, but al-Qaeda is an old established firm. It's more than 20 years old. Is that right? Yes. And it's also kind of a follow-on from an earlier organization called the Services Bureau. So it is a 24, 25-year-old organization. It's well established and very durable. And so I think it will endure. What was the other part of your question?
That's good, thank you.
All right, you're welcome, thank you.
How do you view the Salafi Jihadist movement in the context of Sunni and Shia relations in general?
Well, I think generally speaking, the Salafis are eager to settle scores with the Shias, but they have kind of subordinated that to an approach that favors driving the West out of the Middle East and then trying to deal with the Sunni governments. In kind of an odd way, a premature move against the Shia will undo their efforts to overthrow Mubarak and the al-Sauds, because the popularity of fighting Shias would be very strong. For example, in Iraq, once we go, I'm very sure that the Islamists are afraid that the Shias will go after the Sunnis. The Sunnis then will take aid from whatever quarter they can get it. And suddenly, the governments that should be overthrown, King Abdullah, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, will become important because they'll be supplying guns to the Sunnis. On bin Laden's part, it's been very clear that there is a priority of goals that had to be conducted seriatim and not in parallel. First, to try to drive us out, then go after the apostate governments and the Israelis, and finally to settle scores with the Shias. I don't think there's any ecumenicalism among the Salafis.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
For the average citizen, the military is in Afghanistan. By all accounts, bin Laden is in Pakistan. And you hear very little about American policy designed to capture bin Laden, which makes me ask you the question, one, what is the U.S. policy now or strategy toward bin Laden? And also, what should it be?
For my various sins, sir, I worked out of 22 years, probably about 18 on Afghanistan in one way or another. And the truth is that from the first, the only opportunity we had was to go in there in almost a punitive expedition to eliminate as much of al-Qaeda and the Taliban as we could, leave with the full knowledge that we might have to do it a second time. Instead, we went there, killed very few of the enemy, and stayed to build Monticello on the Kabul River. What is our policy there? I'm damned if I know. But part of it is trying to find someone else to do our dirty work. How long have we heard, for example, that the Pakistanis haven't done enough? And I think any kind of rational assessment would say, of all the people who have helped us against this enemy, no one has done more than Pakistan. Musharraf let us have virtually complete overflight rights over his country. Parts of Karachi Harbor are a NATO naval base. The agency's presence, and I think the military's presence, and probably the State Department's presence, has greatly expanded in Pakistan. Every major al-Qaeda figure who was caught in Pakistani cities was caught with the assistance of ISI. And most remarkably, Musharraf sent the army into the border areas and caused himself a civil war, which is getting worse. So I think one of the great problems America has is we still haven't escaped from the Cold War. We still think there are folks out there who are going to do our dirty work, and they're not going to do it. And I think, frankly, and I'm surprised the parents of U.S. service people don't object, but our young men and women in uniform are being played for fools. We have 100,000 troops there, and the place is as big or bigger than Texas. And if the media is right, 1 in 3 are shooters. So we have 33,000 shooters in a country bigger than Texas. And what's their assignment? They have to keep Karzai in power. They have to rebuild the economy. They have to build an infrastructure for transportation and communication from scratch. They have to defeat the Taliban. They have to eradicate heroin. And then in their spare time, they kind of look for Osama bin Laden. So Mr. Rumsfeld's idea that you could do this on the cheap has really been proved incorrect.
So do you believe the U.S. government has decided that capturing or killing bin Laden is no longer an achievable goal?
I think there are still probably special forces and certainly CIA people who spend their whole time every day going after him. But it's a matter of resources. How many people are left when all those other tasks are there to be done? And increasingly, we're fighting an insurgency that's not just in the east and in the south, but around the whole country, even in the areas that are supposed to be controlled by our allies there. And we, the president, whatever you think of him, has handed the enemy assurances 3 times now that we're starting to leave this year. And so I think we're probably pretty much done in Afghanistan.
Thank you.
Not a happy story, sir.
No.
I would think from bin Laden's perspective, with our extremely loose gun laws, it would be very easy for him to get a group of men and women, get military assault rifles with 50 caliber ammunition and shoot up a shopping center and cause quite a bit of deaths, or many shopping centers. And I'm just wondering, why that has not happened.
They're not interested in that kind of an attack, sir. They had a very thoroughgoing discussion in their journals after 9/11, and they thought that shooting up pizza parlors or schools or malls would simply rally the American people to the government. Their goal is to not fight us for any longer than they have to. And their goal is to hit us so hard that they'll cause large-scale human casualties, large economic damage, significant psychological trauma for the American people, and a problem that only the U.S. military can address at home, which is one of the reasons they're after different kinds of WMD. That said, I think what we'll see is the kind of attack you mentioned from what are, I think, inaccurately called homegrown terrorists. I think you're going to see car bombs and IEDs and attacks on kind of Hamas-style attacks from young American Muslim males who agree with what the Islamists argue.
They're still trying to get dirty bombs or nuclear.
There's been a big story in the paper the past couple of days that at least Western governments think that they're very close to having that capability. I think it was out of the WikiLeaks business that they took the information.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My question is, given the American foreign policy, particularly since the end of World War II, and given the fact that that is cited as the primary irritant and motivation, would it not behoove us to examine our foreign policy?
Well, yes. I have, for truth in advertising, I am a determined non-interventionist. I think the demonstration of Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Obama coming down on both sides in Egypt shows the bankruptcy of intervening at all in some instances. I have certainly tried, since I left the agency, to at least spark a discussion. There are many, many hot issues there, though. Energy, for example. No politician wants to run on the basis that we need $2 a gallon or whatever as a tax to get energy, more energy sufficient. But I would argue that, had we done something in the last 40 years since the first embargo, There's nothing on the Arabian Peninsula that's worth the life of one Marine if it wasn't for oil. What can you do about Israel? I said something last night on one of the Fox programs. I basically said, you know, the security of Israel depends on tyranny. Bashir, King Abdullah in Jordan, and Mubarak have kept those borders tight. And my God, I got this morning, you know, enormous numbers, between 70 and 100 emails with my face. You know, it's very clever what they can do with Photoshop. My face on Hitler's, you know, my head on Hitler's body, and it doesn't take long, but it's very hard to do. And I always thought, each time bin Laden attacked us, for example, sometimes there'd only be 2 or 3 killed, then there were the 2 embassies, then there was the coal, there was Somalia, then 9/11. And every time I saw that, I thought, the American government's not going to put up with this. They're going to go after this problem, both in terms of going after bin Laden and adjusting policy. Neither of them happened to any great extent. So I guess I'm becoming cynical that unless there's a catastrophe in this country, we'll go along like this for the foreseeable future.
Doesn't that, it goes back to your opening statement in that there are very acceptable and very limited parameters of debate.
Very much so. You know, I'm so old, I don't know if they do it anymore, but as a freshman in college, we had to read the entire de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, and he writes in there that there is great free speech in the United States as long as it falls within a certain circle. And if you're outside that circle, you're not jailed or you're not forbidden to speak, but you're just irrelevant. And I find, you know, any suggestion that any American foreign policy needs to be changed and you become an American hater or an appeaser or an anti-Semite. You know, I gave a couple of speeches for Mr. Paul last election cycle, and because I think he's right about intervention. I think that's what the problem is. And no, America has never fought a war where it's only had its military and intelligence services to use as tools of war. And right now that's where we are. We're like one big Israel. How we get around that, sir, I hope it's not another catastrophe, but as the months go by or years go by, I think that's probably what it's going to take.
I've read all of your books, and I look forward to reading this one.
Thank you, sir.
You talked a little bit earlier, and in your works you also talk about how for most people who are members of these groups, it's the local grievances on the ground, how they want to address their own governments. And somebody else already asked a question kind of along these lines, but I guess my point is if you're trying to decide whether or not to join al-Qaeda or a subsequent similar organization, and your grievances with Saudi Arabia or your grievances with Jordan, doesn't Tunisia and Egypt just show you that if you can gather enough people and have kind of a solid plank on what you want, you may be able to achieve this through other means?
I think over time it may do that, but I think Americans tend to be a little impatient, and maybe 3 weeks after the fact is a little early to tell. But I think you're mostly correct. For bin Laden and his allies, they've sort of flipped Clausewitz on his head because their center of gravity is our foreign policy. To the extent that we maintain it, we provide a glue of unity for a group that is by nature extraordinarily fractious. Zawahiri, even before what went on in Egypt, could barely keep his mouth shut about addressing Egypt exactly. And one of the benefits of a review of our foreign policy and change where it is consistent with our interest is that it will act as a solvent to the glue of unity that they have. Because I think, and I can be wrong, ask my wife, but I think the most enduring remnant of 19th century European imperialism in the Middle East is nationalism. I think that the hardest job bin Laden had was to focus the Saudis out of Saudi Arabia, the Yemenis away from Saleh, the Egyptians away from Mubarak. And what did that was partly bin Laden's own work, but overwhelmingly our invasion of Iraq, which kind of made al-Qaeda and bin Laden, they moved from being a man in a group to kind of a philosophy and a movement. And our goal really needs to be to break that unity and turn the violence back where it belongs. Get the Algerians attacking the junta again. Get the Saudis going after, you know, the royal family. So I think there is room there. Your point is well taken. I think we're just probably a year or two too early to tell whether it's going to work or not.
And my follow-up question was, your thesis seems to be that our actions since 9/11 have been really irrelevant to the war on terror. And I guess my counter to you would be, if that's the case, and the al-Qaeda group was so determined upon attacking United States interests, both in the embassies and in the U.S. Cole and the 9/11, in such close relation to one another, why has it been 10 years since a major attack on U.S. soil?
Well,
Which is a very common question asked, obviously.
Well, my argument has always been that it's rather narrowly defined in the sense that they're helping to defeat 2 American field armies. You know, al-Qaeda's goals, as enunciated in 1996, were to take advantage of the international economic system to push us toward bankruptcy, first. Second, to spread U.S. military and intelligence forces to the point where they had no reserve and flexibility. And third, to create as much dissent at home and to strip away as many of our allies as they could. I'm kind of the view if I'm under Iraq or in a cave in Afghanistan, if that's where Brother Osama is, and you can do it in Islam, he's doing the happy dance. Because it's, you know, it's extraordinary how we have played into his hands in that regard. Why hasn't there been another attack? Partly it's because I don't think they've wanted to do it. But most of all, they have been one of the few places they've boxed themselves in rhetorically is on incrementalism. They promised since '96 that every attack would be incrementally more painful. And so to attack again by shooting up Papa John's, it's not going to wash with the audience. It's got to be bigger than 9/11. So I think that's part of it also.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Michael, you've given us a lot of food for thought tonight, and I thank you. We've unfortunately run out of our time this evening, but I'm sure that your remarks are going to spark a lot of ongoing conversations after the program's over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.